Hey, before we begin, if you find yourself drifting off somewhere in the middle of this one, that is exactly what we hoped for. Take a moment to like the video if this kind of slow, unhurried journey through history is what you come here for. And subscribe if you'd like more. Drop a comment and let us know where you heard about this video. A late night search, a friend's recommendation, a rabbit hole that brought you somewhere quiet and unexpected. We love knowing how people find their way here. Now, turn your lights down, or off entirely if you're feeling brave. Get comfortable, and let's step into a world that existed for almost all of human history. A world that ended so recently we've barely had time to notice what we lost. Tonight, there are no lights, no screens, no electricity, only darkness. Picture that for a moment. Not as a power outage, not as a camping trip, not as an adventure with a defined endpoint where you know the lights are coming back on in the morning. Picture it as simply the way things are, the permanent condition of every evening, the thing you were born into, the thing your parents were born into, the thing every human being who has ever lived was born into, with the exception of the last handful of generations. Darkness at night was not a malfunction. It was not an inconvenience. It was the world, and for most of human history, it ruled every single night without negotiation. We have forgotten what dark actually means. In the modern world, darkness is never quite total. There is always something. A streetlight through the curtain, the standby light on the television, the glow of a phone charging on the bedside table, the faint amber wash that hangs over every city and suburb and bleeds out into the countryside for miles in every direction. Even in the most rural places most of us can reach, there is still the glow of a distant town on the horizon. Still the headlights of a car passing half a mile away. We have so thoroughly saturated the night with light that genuine darkness, the kind of darkness that existed everywhere, every night for all of human history, until roughly 150 years ago, is now something most people living on this planet will never experience. More than 80% of people in the United States and 99% of Europeans live under night skies polluted enough that the Milky Way, the galaxy we live in, the glowing river of light that arced overhead for every human being who ever looked up, is simply invisible to them, not hidden, absent, erased by the light we have made. To understand what nighttime was truly like before electricity, you have to first understand how completely and permanently that erasure has changed us. Not just practically, not just in terms of what we can see, but psychologically, socially, even biologically. The night has changed, and we changed with it, so thoroughly that we barely remember what it was like to be human in the dark. Let us go back, not to any particular century, but to the general condition of human existence for most of our time on Earth. The sun has set. It did not do so dramatically. It was not a metaphor. It simply moved, as it always moves, below the western horizon, and the light went with it. And what was left was the oldest reality of all, darkness. In a pre-industrial village or town, the response to sunset was not a conscious decision. It was a rhythm so deeply embedded in daily life that it required no thought. The end of day was the end of the light, and the end of the light was the end of most of what daily life involved. Fields could not be plowed or harvested in darkness. Animals could not be tended. Cloth could not be woven with precision. Wood could not be worked safely. Letters could not be read. The skills and labors that filled the waking hours of most people's lives were daylight skills. When the sun went down, those things stopped. Not because of any rule or choice, but because the sun was the only thing powerful enough to make them possible. So the household turned inward. The family gathered, not out of sentiment, but out of practical necessity. There was no benefit to being in separate rooms after dark, since light did not stretch far enough to make separation comfortable. And the warmth of a single shared fire could not be duplicated in a second room without the expense of a second fire that most households could not sustain. The pre-electric home was a communal place in the evening hours in ways that have no modern equivalent. When the night came, the walls closed in, and everyone who slept under the same roof shared the same small space of warmth and dim light. In a peasant's home, this was a single room or two at most, the fire at the center providing both heat and the only light that most families ever had for evening hours. That fire was not what we imagine when we think of a cozy fireplace. It was functional and necessary and carefully tended because it was warmth and it was the ability to see your hand in front of your face, and it was the only thing standing between the family and total blackness. The light it gave was orange and uneven, full of movement, casting long, shifting shadows across walls and faces in the low ceiling. It illuminated a circle of perhaps 10 or 12 feet and left everything beyond that circle in near total darkness. It was warm in tone and cold in reach. People who could afford it supplemented the fire with other light sources. But the word afford carries real weight here, because light before electricity was not cheap. It was among the most significant household expenses for anyone who used it regularly. A tallow candle, the most common form of candle available to ordinary people, made from rendered animal fat, burned for roughly 3 to 4 hours, and gave off about as much light as a modern 10-watt bulb. Less, actually. And with considerably more smoke and a smell that modern people would find unpleasant. Tallow candles were a nasty brown color. They sputtered. They needed constant attention to prevent them from smoking or guttering. And they smelled, as one historical account puts it, distinctly of what they were made from. They were the cheap option. Beeswax candles were better in almost every way. Cleaner burn, brighter light, pleasant scent. But beeswax was expensive, and in medieval Europe, beeswax candles were largely reserved for churches and wealthy households. An ordinary family using beeswax to light their home would have been like a modern family burning something valuable every night for the sake of convenience. It simply wasn't done. Rushlights were another option for the very poor. Dried rushes soaked in animal fat burned in a simple holder, but a rushlight of about 40 centimeters would burn for only about half an hour. Half an hour. A full evening of light would require many of them, and the cumulative cost and labor of making them was significant. Oil lamps, burning various oils depending on what was locally available. Olive oil in Mediterranean regions, fish oil or whale oil in Northern Europe. Linseed or other vegetable oils where those were cheaper, were somewhat brighter and more controllable than candles. But the oil itself represented real household expenditure. The phrase, to burn the midnight oil, which we use casually today to mean working late, was a literal description of a choice. To spend the expensive commodity of lamp oil in order to work or read past the point when the firelight alone was sufficient. It was a choice that most ordinary people rarely made. It was the choice of scholars and wealthy people, of those who could afford the cost of a few extra hours of dim, smoky light. What this means practically is that for most of human history, most people went to bed at what we would consider an extraordinarily early hour. Sunset in winter in Northern Europe comes at 3 or 4 in the afternoon. By the time the family had eaten, by the time the children were settled, by the time the minimal essential tasks of the evening were done, it might be 7 o'clock. 8, if the household was prosperous enough for a longer fire. And in the absence of anything to do in the darkness that was cheaper than sleep, sleep is what they did. Most pre-industrial households were in bed by 9 o'clock at the latest, and often considerably earlier. This wasn't laziness or simplicity. It was a response to the fundamental economic and physical reality of their world. Light was expensive, darkness was total, and the body's natural rhythms, undistorted by artificial light, inclined strongly towards sleep when the sun went down. The time inside the house after dark had a quality that is genuinely difficult for a modern person to imagine, because it had no equivalent in our current experience. There was silence of a depth we no longer know. There were no machines, no traffic, no ambient electronic hum, no distant noise of a city. The countryside at night, before industrialization, was acoustically almost completely quiet, broken only by the natural sounds that had always been there. Wind, rain, the settling of the house's timbers, the sounds of animals in the dark outside. Indoors, the family sat or lay in the firelight, and they talked, or they were quiet, or they mended by the fading light, or they simply rested in a way that people now rarely manage. The night inside was not empty. It was full of a specific kind of presence. The presence of people contained together in a small space, in warmth and firelit dimness, with nothing to do but be with each other, and with the dark. What happened in those hours deserves more attention than we usually give it. The modern evening is crowded with alternatives: screens, streaming, music, the internet, the phone that never stops offering something to look at. The pre-electric evening had none of this. What it had was people and stories, and the particular intimacy that grows between human beings who have nothing to do but occupy the same space in the same semi-darkness for hours at a stretch. Oral tradition, the transmission of knowledge, history, genealogy, myth, and community memory through storytelling, flourished in the evening hours before electricity. Not because pre-industrial people were literary or culturally sophisticated in any way we would recognize, but because the evening provided hours with nothing else to fill them. And the human need to make sense of the world through narrative is as biological as the need to sleep. The stories told around pre-industrial fires were functional in ways that modern entertainment is not. They transmitted the accumulated knowledge of the community, encoded practical information about the landscape and the seasons in mythological form, established moral frameworks, located the family and community in a larger historical and cosmological story. They were entertainment that was also instruction, pleasure that was also memory, connection that was also culture. Children learned the world primarily from these evening hours, not from books, which most children had no access to and could not read, but from the voices of adults speaking in the firelight about what had happened and what it meant. Grandparents told their grandchildren the stories their grandparents had told them. Seasonal knowledge, when to plant, when to expect frost, which plants indicated what about the soil, which animals' behaviors predicted what about the weather, was transmitted in this way, accumulating over generations, refined by long observation and passed forward by the mechanism of the evening fire. Children fell asleep early. The fire was allowed to die down. And then came the darkness that people of that time knew in a way that we have completely lost. Real darkness, the complete absence of visible light, does something particular to human perception. Your eyes, denied any photons to process, do not simply stop functioning. They search. They produce their own imagery. Anyone who has spent significant time in genuine total darkness, in a cave, in a windowless room, in the countryside on a moonless overcast night, will tell you that the darkness is not empty. It moves. It has texture. The eye, hunting for something to process, generates its own shapes in the absence of input, and those shapes exist in a space between imagination and perception that the ordinary language of wakefulness cannot easily describe. There are sounds that seem louder, not because the night is noisier, but because the darkness has removed the visual context that normally allows the brain to categorize and dismiss them. A branch moving against the house, an animal somewhere outside, a sound from the road. For a modern person, this would be unsettling. For the people who lived in it every night, it was simply the familiar condition of night, managed, navigated, sometimes feared, but intimately known. And that familiarity with darkness shaped the inner life of pre-industrial people in ways that we are only beginning to understand. The most powerful and widespread response to darkness throughout human history has been the creation of stories to fill it. Not stories in the abstract, but stories that populated the darkness with specific presences. Things that moved in the night, things that lurked at the edge of the firelight, things that were not present during the day but arrived when the sun went down. In Christian Europe, the theological framework reinforced what the dark itself seemed to suggest. That darkness was the domain of evil. That night was when the devil and his agents walked freely. That the honest person's place after dark was indoors, behind locked doors, near the fire, away from whatever moved in the blackness outside. These were not simply superstitions imposed from above by the church. They were the natural human response to a genuine experience. When you cannot see, every sound becomes a potential threat. When the night is absolute, the invisible expands to fill everything. And the imagination, which evolved over millions of years to anticipate and protect against danger, does its job with unusual intensity. The witches and demons and restless dead that populated the medieval night were the names that a pre-scientific culture gave to the experience of unlit darkness and everything that experience produced in the human nervous system. There were also real dangers, not supernatural, but immediate and practical. Fire was among the most serious. A household that slept with the fire dying in the hearth, a candle improperly extinguished, an ember that landed on the floor rushes, was a household that could cease to exist by morning. Medieval towns burned with terrible regularity, entire neighborhoods taken by fires that spread along timber-framed buildings, while people slept and had no warning until the heat and smoke were already inside their homes. The night watch, found in virtually every town of any size in medieval and early modern Europe, existed partly to cry the hours and maintain order, but fundamentally to watch for fire. When a watchman cried out in the night in the streets of a medieval town, the first thing his neighbors listened for, before they caught his words, was whether his voice held the particular urgency of a man crying fire, because fire at night in a pre-industrial town was one of the most feared things on earth. Crime was another darkness-specific danger. The night belonged to those who had no legitimate reason to be out after curfew, and in most towns of medieval and early modern Europe, curfew was a real institution, not a metaphor. The bell that rang at curfew was a signal that the honest were expected to be inside, and the streets were being surrendered to whoever remained in them. Thieves understood darkness the way merchants understood markets. It was the environment in which their particular business was most easily conducted. To be outside after dark without a lantern and a good explanation was, in many cities, legally sufficient grounds for detention by the night watch. The darkness itself was suspicious, not because of supernatural concerns alone, but because anyone who wanted to be unseen had every practical reason to be out in it. The house bolted its doors. The windows, if it had any, were shuttered. The family settled into whatever sleep arrangements were standard for their time and place. Beds in many pre-industrial households were not single-occupancy structures. A bed was a significant piece of furniture, expensive and central to the household, and it was shared by a couple, by children, sometimes by multiple generations. The warmth of other bodies was practical in a world without central heating, and the darkness made the proximity of familiar people a comfort that the night's uncertainty demanded. Sleeping alone was the experience of the wealthy, not the norm. The sounds of other people's breathing, the movement of someone else in the bed, the warmth and presence of the family gathered under the same roof, and often under the same covers. These were the ordinary conditions of the pre-electric night, and they shaped the quality of sleep in ways we have barely begun to study. There was also the presence of the house itself as a sound environment in darkness. Timber-framed buildings settle and speak in ways that stone or brick do not. The wood contracted as temperatures dropped, making small sounds that a sleeping household learned to distinguish from the sounds of intrusion. Rain on a thatched roof was different from rain on tile, and both were different from the sound of snow settling on a roof that was not built for it. The wind, through gaps in the walls or around shutters, had a particular vocabulary. A household that had lived in the same building for years knew its sounds the way a person knows their own heartbeat, below the level of conscious attention until something changed in them, at which point the attention surfaced immediately and absolutely. This was not anxiety. It was the finely tuned awareness of people who depended on their environment to warn them of things they could not see. Here is where the history of the pre-electric night becomes most surprising, most personally relevant, and most directly connected to the sleep many of us are trying to find tonight. For most of human history, sleep was not what it has become. It did not follow the pattern that we now consider completely natural and normal. The 8-hour consolidated block, entered once per night, maintained until morning. What historian A. Roger Eckhart found in more than 2,000 references drawn from sources spanning ancient Rome through the early industrial era, across dozens of languages and cultures, is that the dominant pattern of sleep in pre-industrial Western societies was something entirely different. He called it segmented sleep, or biphasic sleep, and the pattern was consistent and widespread. A first sleep of 3 to 4 hours, followed by a period of wakefulness lasting roughly an hour, followed by a second sleep that continued until dawn. This was not insomnia. This was not a sleep disorder. This was the ordinary rhythm of the pre-electric night, and it appears in sources ranging from Homer's Odyssey, where the phrase "after first sleep" appears as naturally as we might say "after midnight," through ancient Roman literature, medieval diaries and court documents, medical texts, prayer books, and works of popular fiction. The references to first sleep and second sleep appear without explanation, without any sense that they are describing something unusual, which is itself significant. People wrote about first sleep the way we write about lunch, as a known feature of daily experience that required no clarification. Thucydides used the phrase. Virgil used it. Medieval French documents used it. A 16th century French doctor's manual discussed it. A 17th century English diary noted it. These were not edge cases. They were the ordinary vocabulary of people describing their ordinary nights. When researcher Thomas Ware at the National Institute of Mental Health conducted a clinical study in the early 90s, he deprived subjects of artificial light for several weeks, allowing them only natural light during the day. Within weeks, every single subject had transitioned to segmented sleep. First a period of several hours, then wakefulness of about an hour, then a second period, until morning. The subjects described the waking interval as a state of remarkable calm, not the agitated wakefulness of insomnia, but something quieter and more deliberate. Blood samples taken during this interval showed elevated levels of prolactin, the same hormone associated with the relaxed calm. After orgasm, after meditation, after nursing, the body was doing something in that time. Something it had evidently been doing for a very long time before the electric light took it away. The hour or so between first and second sleep was its own kind of time. Roger Eckhart's research describes an extraordinary range of activities that people undertook during this interval. Some simply lay in the warmth of their beds in a state of calm wakefulness. The researchers comparing it to meditation have described as producing a neurochemical state similar to deep relaxation, high in the hormone prolactin, with a quality distinct from either sleep or ordinary waking. Some couples use this time for intimacy. A 16th century French doctor's manual actually advised that the best time for conception was after the first sleep, when they have more enjoyment. Some people rose to tend the fire, to drink a little water or weak ale, to pray. Some, in towns where the night watch was reliable enough to make it safe, visited close neighbors. Some, in the darkness of their own beds, reflected on the dreams that first sleep had brought, which Eckert's research suggests were unusually vivid, and which people of that era took with considerable seriousness as messages worth contemplating before they dissolved in second sleep. The scientific support for this pattern is real. In a clinical study at the National Institute of Mental Health in the early 1990s, subjects deprived of artificial light for several weeks naturally reverted to segmented sleep. A 2013 study found that camping for 2 weeks, exposure only to natural light and firelight, shifted sleep timing and produced signs of the biphasic pattern. The body's inclination toward 2 periods of sleep with a quiet interval is not a historical curiosity. It is, apparently, what human beings naturally do when artificial light stops overriding the circadian clock that millions of years of evolution built for a world without electricity. Our contemporary insomnia epidemic, specifically the kind that wakes people in the middle of the night, perhaps around 2 or 3 in the morning, and holds them awake for an hour before allowing them back to sleep, may be, in the most literal sense, a memory. Not a malfunction of the modern body, but a persistence of a very old pattern in a world that no longer accommodates it. The people who woke in the quiet between their first and second sleep were not ill. They were simply awake, in the particular soft wakefulness of that interval, doing what humans had always done in that time. And then they went back to sleep. Beyond the bedroom, the darkness outside the house was not entirely without movement. Some people had work that required the night. Bakers in medieval towns began their work before dawn, stoking the ovens that would produce the day's bread. Midwives moved through dark streets when babies arrived at inconvenient hours. Travelers who had no choice moved on moonlit roads, carrying lanterns or torches, navigating by the landmarks they knew. Smiths and those in heat-intensive trades sometimes worked through the cool of the night rather than the heat of the day. The night was not sealed, not completely surrendered, but those who moved through it understood themselves to be in a different kind of space, operating under different rules, taking risks that the day did not require. The dangers of the darkness were managed rather than eliminated. The night watch called the hours, still audible from inside the house, a reassuring pattern of sound against the silence, confirming that someone was awake and that the time was passing, normally, and that no fire had been spotted. No alarm was being raised. The locked doors and shuttered windows were practical as well as psychological. The family dog, if there was one, was a genuine early warning system. The fire's coals, banked carefully to last until morning, were tended with the care you would give to something precious that you could not replace. These were not excessive anxieties. They were the sensible precautions of people who understood their environment. And through the shutters, and through the cracks in the walls, and through the open doors of summer, there were the stars. This is the thing that is almost impossible to convey to most people alive today, what the sky looked like. Not in any exotic location, not in any special circumstance, but on any clear night from any place on Earth before light pollution existed. The unaided human eye, fully adjusted to genuine darkness, and it takes roughly 20 minutes for the eyes to fully dark adapt, to open to their maximum sensitivity, can perceive somewhere between 5,000 and 7,000 individual stars on a clear night. That number is so far from what most of us have ever seen that it functions almost as a different kind of sky. Not a sky with more stars in it, but a sky of a fundamentally different character. The Milky Way, in conditions of genuine darkness, is not the faint smudge that those lucky enough to be far from cities occasionally glimpse. It is an arc of light that spans the entire sky, so dense with individual stars that they blur into each other. A river of cold white light that casts visible shadows on very dark nights. It is bright enough to read by on the clearest nights, if barely. It has structure, dark lanes where dust clouds interrupt the starlight, concentrations where arms of the galaxy pass closer, a bright heart at the center. It is not subtle, it is overwhelming. Ancient peoples across every culture on Earth saw it every clear night of their lives, and it is no accident that it appears in the mythology of virtually every human civilization that has left a record. 100 years ago, the Milky Way was visible from the center of Paris. This is not a figure of speech. The French astronomer Guillaume Bigourdan, observing from the Paris Observatory in 1917, reported that the Milky Way was visible from the city on summer evenings. In 1924, an observatory outside what was then small Canberra had to move to darker skies because even the modest light pollution of a small Australian city was beginning to interfere with observation. Today, roughly a third of humanity and 80% of those in the United States cannot see the Milky Way from where they live. For the people of the pre-electric world, the night sky was not an occasional special experience. It was simply the sky. It was navigational information, seasonal calendar, religious symbol, storytelling canvas, philosophical provocation, and nightly companion, all at once. The constellations were not points on a chart that astronomy enthusiasts memorized. They were the regular inhabitants of the overhead world, as familiar as neighboring houses, rising and setting in their predictable patterns, through the seasons in ways that told you where you were in the year and where you were on the earth. When those who could read the stars looked up at night, they were not looking at a mystery. They were looking at a clock, a calendar, a compass, and a story, all simultaneously. There is something quietly staggering about this. Once it fully lands, every human being who has ever lived, from the first modern humans in Africa 100,000 years ago, through every civilization in every part of the world, until the generation that first saw gaslit streets, spent their entire lives looking at the same sky that is there right now. The stars that guided the ships of the Phoenicians, the farmers of ancient Mesopotamia, the navigators of Polynesia, the monks of medieval Ireland. They are the same stars that are above you tonight, moving in the same patterns they have always moved. The Milky Way that arced over every one of our ancestors is still there, above the light pollution, waiting. We lost sight of it. It never moved. Navigation by stars was not the preserve of sailors and explorers. It was local and domestic. A farmer knew which cluster's appearance above the horizon meant it was time to plant, which stars rising preceded frost, how the changing position of the moon in relation to particular stars tracked the months. This knowledge was passed from parent to child in cultures where literacy was rare and books were absent, carried entirely in human memory, refined over generations of careful observation, conducted from the same piece of ground that every previous generation had lived and died on. The sky was a text that every clear night offered to anyone who would look, and it was red. The quality of darkness itself was not uniform. Moonless nights were black in a way that modern people have almost no reference for. Nights with a full moon were extraordinary by comparison. The moon at its full provides enough light to walk safely, to recognize faces, to work if the work was simple enough. Moonlit nights were the nights for travel, for courting, for the activities that darkness otherwise made difficult or impossible. The phases of the moon were not romantic abstractions. They were a practical weekly schedule. You planned around them. You knew instinctively where in its cycle the moon was, because you had watched it every clear night since childhood, and its light was among the most valuable resources the night offered. This moon awareness shaped the social calendar in ways that we have entirely forgotten. Fairs, markets, and communal gatherings were frequently scheduled around the full moon, not because of any mystical association, but because the full moon meant that people could travel to and from the event safely in the dark. The harvest moon, the full moon nearest to the autumn equinox, was practically significant because it rises shortly after sunset and remains large and bright for several nights in a row, extending the hours of working light at precisely the moment when the harvest needed to be brought in before the first frost. The moon gave extra hours, and those extra hours could be the difference between a full winter larder and a difficult one. Winter nights were longest, and the long winter nights had a quality distinct from summer ones. 14, 15, 16 hours of darkness in Northern Europe. Darkness that began in mid-afternoon and did not release until well into the following morning. These long nights were not simply longer versions of summer nights. They had a different psychological weight, a different relationship to the household's resources of warmth and light. The fuel that kept the fire burning through a December night was planned for in summer and carefully rationed. The light that extended the evening past the fire was a luxury that winter's length made more precious and more costly. Summer nights were shorter, and the comparative brevity of summer darkness, never more than 7 or 8 hours in much of Europe, gave the nights a different quality. More activity was possible, more movement was comfortable. The long summer evenings, before the night truly fell, belonged to a middle time that was neither day nor dark. And in that time, the social world extended outdoors in ways that winter never permitted. The quality of darkness itself was not uniform. The silence of a pre-industrial night is another of the things we cannot truly recover, even in remote places, because the machinery of the modern world has filled every inhabited corner of the earth with some level of ambient sound. Before engines, before electricity, before the Industrial Revolution and its permanent mechanical hum, the quiet of a rural night was as deep as the darkness. The most distant sounds were natural. Water, wind, animals. The absence of human-made noise in the countryside was absolute. In towns and cities, there was more. The watch calling the hours, the occasional sound of a cart or horse, voices from late taverns. But even these were intermittent, and between them, the quiet returned. This silence had a particular effect on human consciousness that we have also largely lost. Without the constant low-level noise of modernity to occupy the background of awareness, the mind in the quiet of the pre-electric night, had a different relationship with its own thoughts. People reported dreams with greater frequency and vividness, in part because the interval between first and second sleep was given to reflecting on them before they faded. Inner life, prayer, contemplation, the kind of sustained, quiet attention to one's own thoughts that most modern people find surprisingly difficult, was simply part of what the night was for. Not a practice that had to be consciously cultivated against the grain of the environment. A natural consequence of having hours of darkness with nothing that could compete for attention. The 16th century essayist Michel de Montaigne wrote at length about the quality of thought available to him in the night's quiet. Samuel Pepys, the famous English diarist, writing in the 1660s, recorded his nighttime reflections regularly, the thoughts that came in the dark between first and second sleep, as among the most vivid and productive of his days. These were not exceptional people with unusual habits of introspection. They were people describing what the night made available to anyone who was in it long enough to receive it. The night was, in the language of many contemplative traditions, a teacher. What it taught was silence, and what silence gave was a quality of self-awareness that the noise of the day consistently prevented. The relationship between darkness and prayer appears in virtually every contemplative tradition across cultures. The night office, the midnight prayer, the call to prayer before dawn, is not a coincidence of separate religious developments. It is a recognition across traditions that the deep quiet of the night, stripped of the distractions of day, opens something in human awareness that other times of day do not. The monks who rose for the night office at Matins, around 2 or 3 in the morning, were doing so partly in the quiet hour between first and second sleep, that neurologically distinct interval of calm wakefulness that the darkness provided. Whatever theology surrounded the practice, the body had been moving toward that wakefulness on its own. Consider what it means that the single most radical change in human experience of the night, the arrival of gaslighting in the early 1800s, followed by electric lighting in the late 1800s, happened so recently. The last people in the industrializing world to experience pre-electric darkness were born less than 200 years ago. Their grandchildren are still alive. The practice of segmented sleep was being discussed in medical literature as recently as 1911, when an American advice columnist suggested it as a novelty to readers who couldn't sleep well. The language suggesting that at least some of his audience would have found the idea unfamiliar. Within a single lifetime, the consolidated 8-hour sleep became the norm. Within another lifetime, its disruption became a diagnosable disorder. We have medicated, worried over, and treated with pharmaceutical intervention something that may simply be the body's natural inclination toward a pattern of sleep that the electric light bulb made obsolete. Roger Eckhurch, the historian whose 2 decades of research unearthed more than 2,000 references to segmented sleep across a dozen languages, put it this way: our form of sleep today is remarkably young, with a history dating back only 2 centuries, not to the primeval past. The 8-hour consolidated sleep that we treat as the baseline of normal human function is, by the standards of human history, an experiment that began around 1900. The biology underneath it is far older, and that biology, when given the chance, when the artificial light is reduced and the natural darkness is allowed to do what darkness has always done, begins to remember something. If you have ever woken in the small hours of the night, somewhere between 2 and 4 in the morning, not from a nightmare or a sound, but simply from a quiet readiness to be awake, and found yourself lying in a particular calm that was different from either sleep or ordinary wakefulness, you may have experienced a vestige of something very old. Not insomnia, not a malfunction, the interval, the quiet time between first and second sleep that human beings maintained for as long as human beings have been sleeping in darkness, and lost in the space of a single lifetime when the lights came on and the night was shortened and the body's natural clock was overridden by something that was never part of its design. The night before, electricity was not a simpler time or a more innocent one. It was a time of genuine danger and genuine hardship, of fire and crime and cold and the physical difficulty of living without the tools that light makes possible. The darkness was real, and its dangers were real, and the people who navigated it developed practical and psychological resources for doing so that were both sophisticated and deeply embedded in culture. They were not waiting for electricity so that their lives could begin. They were fully alive in the world they had. It is worth pausing here to name something that the history of the night makes visible: the astonishing speed at which the change happened. The first gas-lit streets appeared in major European cities around 1810 to 1820. By 1850, urban streets in much of the industrializing world were gas-lit. Electric light arrived in the 1880s and spread rapidly through cities. By 1920, most homes in American and European cities had electricity. The entire transition from the night that had existed for all of human history to the night we have now, lit, extended, fundamentally restructured, took roughly 100 years. In the context of human history, This is not even a blink. In the context of biological evolution, it is nothing. The genome that governs when you feel sleepy and when you feel alert, when your body temperature drops in preparation for sleep, and when your melatonin rises, was built over millions of years for a world where the sun provided all the light there was and darkness was the reliable nightly signal for rest. That genome has not changed since the light bulb arrived. It is still receiving the same ancient signal. The light simply overrode it, without biological consent, and the body has been navigating the resulting mismatch ever since. The epidemics of disrupted sleep that characterize the modern world are not inevitable features of human biology. The reliance on sleep medications, the widespread middle-of-the-night wakefulness interpreted as pathology, the anxiety about what constitutes a proper night's rest, the difficulty maintaining a consistent sleep schedule when screens and artificial light extend the day indefinitely. These are features of human biology placed in collision with an artificial environment that appeared too recently for adaptation to follow. The body expects darkness. It was built for darkness. The darkness it received for hundreds of thousands of years, the darkness that shaped its deepest rhythms, has been taken from it in the name of productivity and safety and the useful extension of waking hours. And the biological debt that created has not been fully calculated or acknowledged. None of this means the electric light was a mistake, or that the world before it was better in any straightforward way. The dangers of the pre-electric night were real. The cold, the fire risk, the vulnerability to crime, the limitation of all productive activity to the hours of daylight, the diseases that candlelight and open fires helped spread, the isolation of winter nights that stretched 14 hours without relief. These were not minor inconveniences. They shaped life in ways that the loss of darkness does not. The trade was real, and on most measures, it was worth making. But something was lost, and what was lost was not simply a visual phenomenon or a quality of sky. It was a particular configuration of human experience that the long, genuine night uniquely provided. The hours with no alternative use. The quiet that enforced a kind of reflection, unavailable in daylight. The stars overhead that connected every waking moment to something larger and older and more enduring than the immediate concerns of daily life. The segmented sleep with its interval of calm wakefulness that the body now sometimes reaches for in the small hours and finds nothing prepared to receive it. The stories told in firelight, they carried knowledge forward across generations through the mechanism of the evening's captive darkness. These were not features of underdevelopment or poverty of imagination. They were features of a world that had not yet broken its alignment with its own biology. A world in which the night was allowed to be what the night has always been. Think for a moment about what it meant to be a person in that world. You knew every phase of the moon not as astronomical trivia, but as the schedule your life ran on. You knew the stars not as names on a chart, but as the reliable inhabitants of the overhead world, rising and setting in the patterns your grandparents had taught you, returning each season in the same sequence they had followed before. Any person now living was born. You knew the sounds your house made in the dark, and the sounds that did not belong to it. You knew the quality of a dying fire and how long the coals would hold through the night. You knew what genuine darkness felt like in your eyes, the way they searched and found their own imagery in the absence of anything to process. And you knew also the particular relief of the first light. Not the electric switch that erases darkness in an instant, but the slow gray arrival of dawn that announced itself incrementally over half an hour, giving the sleeping household time to surface from sleep and second sleep, in the warm interval in between, and to meet the returning light with bodies that had spent the whole of the dark hours doing what bodies had always done in darkness. And what they had that we have largely lost is a relationship with darkness itself, a familiarity with its qualities, an adaptation to its rhythms, an intimacy with the sounds of the night and the patterns of the sky, and the particular quality of attention that long hours without light produce in a human mind that is still, at its deepest layers, wired for the world it evolved in. The 8 hours of consolidated sleep that the electric light imposed on us in the course of a few decades overrides something our biology had been doing for far longer. The middle-of-the-night wakefulness that many people experience as pathology may be, from the body's perspective, nothing more than the interval it has always known was there. And perhaps the sky is worth one more thought as you settle into the dark tonight. In the countryside, on a clear night, in any place far enough from the nearest town that the horizon is genuinely dark, you can still see some of what they saw. Not all of it. The Milky Way is still there, above the light pollution, unchanged, exactly where it has always been. The stars that served as clock and calendar and compass for 100,000 years of human beings are still in their patterns overhead. The same stars that guided travelers and farmers and sailors and every person who ever looked up and found something to navigate by are there tonight, as they were last night, as they will be tomorrow, indifferent to everything that has happened to the world below them. The electric light has been here for 150 years. Human beings who looked up at night have been here for at least 100,000. The body remembers things that long. Sleep well. The night is the same as it has always been, only we have changed. If tonight's quiet journey through the history of darkness gave you something to settle into, a sense of what the night once was, a little more understanding of why the body does what it does in the small hours, please consider leaving a like and subscribing if you haven't already. It helps this channel reach the people who need exactly this kind of quiet company at the end of a long day. We'll be here next time somewhere else in history, and just as close to home.